She was standing on the driveway before I even had a chance to put the truck in park. I saw her the moment I turned onto Birchwood Street, arms already crossed, chin already lifted, positioned directly between me and the front door, like she had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times and was finally getting her chance to perform it. I had been driving for 11 hours. I left Billings, Montana at 4 in the morning, stopped twice for gas and once for a sandwich I barely touched, and I pulled onto that street with road dust still on my jacket and the kind of exhaustion that settles behind your eyes and doesn't let go. My father had died 4 days earlier. I was there to pay my respects. What happened in the next 40 minutes would set in motion something I had been unknowingly preparing for 18 years, and the woman standing on that driveway had absolutely no idea she had already lost. My name is Dennis Calloway. I am 51 years old. I spent the better part of my adult life working construction and industrial maintenance across 3 states, and I am not a man who raises his voice easily. My father raised me to believe that a man's actions do his talking, that the loudest thing in any room should be your record, not your mouth. Raymond Calloway taught me that. He taught me a lot of things in that small house on that quiet street in Delbrook, Illinois, a town of about 9,000 people sitting flat and wide between 2 grain elevator towers and a water tower that still has the old high school mascot painted on it in colors that have been fading since 1987. The house itself was nothing grand. It was a 3-bedroom wood frame built in 1962, sitting on just under 1/3 of an acre, with a detached garage. Raymond had insulated himself and a backyard garden that ran about 40 feet deep along the south fence. He grew tomatoes every summer. Big ugly ones, cracked at the top, sweeter than anything you could buy in a store. The kind that only happen when someone has been working the same soil for decades, when a piece of ground has been tended long enough that it starts giving back more than you put in. I grew up eating those tomatoes off the vine in August with my shirt already dirty from whatever I had been doing in the yard, and I did not understand until I was much older that they tasted the way they did because of the specific patience of the man who grew them. I knew every sound that house made. I knew which floorboard creaked third from the left at the top of the stairs. I knew the way the kitchen window stuck in August when the wood swelled with humidity. I knew the smell of that garage in winter, motor oil and cedar, and the particular cold that settles into unheated concrete at 2 in the morning when the temperature outside has dropped below 15. My father had worked as a machinist for 31 years at a manufacturing plant 12 miles outside of town, and when he retired, he kept his hands busy with small engine repair out of that garage. Lawn mowers, generators, the occasional vintage motorcycle someone brought him in a trailer. He charged fair prices and he did honest work, and he was exactly the kind of man who never needed anyone to know how good he was, because the people who mattered already knew. He was also, I would come to understand much later, a man who watched everything very carefully and said very little about what he saw, and who had been building something in silence for a very long time. With the same precision he brought to every piece of machinery that came through that garage door. I left Delbrook 2 weeks after my 22nd birthday. A foreman named Carl Briggs offered me a job on a commercial framing crew in Springfield, and I took it because the money was better than anything I could find locally, and because I was 22 and believed that forward motion was the same thing as progress. My father shook my hand on the porch the morning I left. Not a hug, not a long speech. He shook my hand, held it for about 3 seconds longer than usual, and told me to call. On Sundays. I called on Sundays for the next 29 years without missing more than a handful. Those calls were not long. Raymond Calloway was not a phone person, but they were consistent, and in their consistency, they meant something that I think both of us understood without ever saying it out loud. Some men build their relationships in silence, in the accumulated weight of small, reliable actions repeated over decades, and if you do not know how to read that language, you will mistake it for distance. It was never distance. It was just the only dialect either of us had. Gloria entered the picture in 2006. She was married to my half-brother Terry, who was 41 at the time and had been cycling through a series of jobs that never quite worked out for reasons that were always slightly someone else's fault. Terry and I shared a father, but different mothers, and we had never been close in the way some brothers are close. There was no animosity between us when we were young, just distance. The kind that forms naturally when 2 people have different upbringings and different temperaments and never make a particular effort to close the gap. Terry was the kind of man who could construct a compelling argument for why every bad decision he ever made was actually a reasonable response to circumstances beyond his control. He had a gift for narrative, for finding the version of events in which he was the protagonist of a story that happened to him rather than a story he made. Gloria was the kind of woman who not only believed those narratives, but reinforced them, built upon them, handed them back to him stronger than she found them. Over time, she had become the mechanism by which his passivity was converted into forward motion. She was the engine. He was the justification she needed for the direction they were already going. They came to my father's house in October of 2006 with 2 cars packed full and a story about a landlord who had sold the building with 30 days' notice. Raymond told them they could stay in the spare bedroom for a couple of months while they got back on their feet. He told me this on the Sunday call that week with the particular tone he used when he had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with, but had determined was the correct thing to do. I did not push back. He was my father, and he was 60 years old, and he had the right to make decisions about his own house without his son second-guessing him from 3 states away. I let it go. That was the last time I made that mistake. They were still there 18 years later. What happened during those 18 years is not a story of sudden dramatic betrayal. It is slower and quieter than that, and I think that slowness is actually what makes it worth understanding. Gloria moved into that house as a guest and understood herself to be a guest for perhaps the first 6 months. Then she began making a series of small decisions, each one individually reasonable, that collectively constituted a quiet and thorough annexation of a space that had never belonged to her. She rearranged the kitchen in 2007 because she was the one cooking and the layout was inefficient. She repainted the living room in 2009 because the old color was depressing and Raymond said he didn't mind. She replaced the furniture in 2017 because the old couch had a broken spring. She took down photographs from the hallway in stages over about 4 years, replacing them with pictures of her own family, her own vacations, her children from a previous marriage who visited occasionally and called Raymond by his first name. By 2015, if you had walked into that house as a stranger, nothing in it would have told you that Raymond Calloway had lived there for 50 years. It would have told you that Gloria lived there, and that someone else's elderly father was occupying the back bedroom quietly and with decreasing authority over his own space. She had not stolen the house in any dramatic single moment. She had simply redecorated it, year by year, choice by choice, until it became hers in every way except the one that was going to matter when it mattered most. The first time I wired money home was March of 2006, before Terry and Gloria had even arrived. Raymond mentioned on a Sunday call that the gas bill had run higher than expected because the furnace was cycling inefficiently. He was not asking. He never asked. He mentioned it the way he mentioned everything, as information, the way a man reports weather conditions, not as a request for intervention. I sent $340 that week and told him to get the furnace looked at. He thanked me in the way that suggested he had been hoping I would offer, but would never have said so directly. That was the beginning of what became a pattern so regular it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a recurring bill I paid every month, which in a very real sense is exactly what it was. Over the next 18 years, I paid that bill 216 times. Some months it was $200 for a pharmacy copay. Some months it was $1,200 for a heating repair. In 2019, a section of the roof over the back bedroom had to come off and be redone from the decking up. $6,800 sent in 2 transfers. In the winter of 2022, Raymond had a cardiac episode that landed him in the hospital for 4 nights. Out-of-pocket costs just under $4,000 after Medicare. I covered it without being asked, the same way I had covered everything else, the same way I had been covering everything since that first furnace call in 2006. I kept records of every transaction, not because I expected anything in return, but because I am the kind of person who keeps records. It is a habit formed by decades of working in industries where an undocumented mistake costs someone their livelihood. What I did not know until much later was that my father had been keeping records too, and that his records were even more thorough than mine, and that he had been building something with those records that was designed to outlast him by a very long time. None of that money, not $1 of $203,740 across 216 transactions over 18 years, ever came from Terry and Gloria. Not one utility bill. Not one copay. Not one repair. What did come from that household during that period was a new car for Gloria in 2011, a second one in 2016, two vacations to Florida I heard about secondhand, and a kitchen renovation in 2014 that Terry convinced Raymond was cosmetically necessary, and that cost $9,000 paid out of my father's retirement savings. I want you to hold that number next to the other one. $9,000 extracted from a retired machinist's savings account. $203,740 from the son who was 3 states away and never once asked for anything back. I want to tell you about the last time I saw my father standing up, because I think you need to understand that moment before you can understand everything else. It was August of 2021. I had flown to Chicago and driven a rental car down to Delbrook specifically to see him. When I called to tell him I was coming, he said he would look forward to it, and he said that twice, which for Raymond Calloway was something close to effusive. I pulled into the driveway at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, and before I could get out of the car, Gloria came through the front door and down the porch steps wearing the expression I had seen on her face before, the preemptive authority of a person who has already decided how a situation is going to go and is simply arriving to execute the decision. She told me Raymond was resting. I told her I had called ahead, and he was expecting me. She told me the doctor had said he needed rest. I asked which doctor had said that, and on what date. She told me it was none of my business. I asked her to please go inside and ask him whether he wanted to see me. She told me she did not need to do that because she already knew the answer. I stood in that driveway for 40 minutes. I did not get back in the car. I did not raise my voice. I stood there because leaving felt like agreeing to something I was not prepared to agree to, and because some part of me believed that if I stayed long enough, Raymond would come to the door himself. During the last 15 of those 40 minutes, I could see him at the window of his second-floor bedroom, standing at the glass with one hand raised. Not waving exactly. More like a man who has seen something he was not expecting and reached toward it before he quite decided to. We looked at each other across the distance of a driveway and a second-floor window and 29 years of Sunday phone calls and everything we had never quite found the words for. Then Gloria came back to the porch and told me to leave or she would call the police. I got back in the rental car. I drove to the end of the block, pulled over, and sat there for a while looking at nothing in particular. I was not crying. I want to be clear about that, not because there would be anything wrong with it, but because what I was feeling was not grief exactly. It was something colder and more specific. It was the feeling of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago, and who is deciding very quietly what he intends to do with that understanding. 3 months after that afternoon, Raymond Calloway walked into an attorney's office on Main Street in Delbrook and made sure that what he knew would be on the record permanently, in a form that no amount of driveway authority could touch. Raymond died on a Tuesday in November. Heart failure. He was 74 years old. I found out from a 6-word text message Terry sent at 6:47 in the morning. Dad passed last night. Funeral Thursday. I sat with that message for a long time before I responded. Then I called Terry and got voicemail and left a message saying I would be there. I did not announce what time I was arriving. It had not yet occurred to me that there was any reason to. I left Montana at 4 in the morning on the day of the service. 11 hours, 2 gas stops, 1 stop outside of Rockford where I pulled into a truck stop lot and sat in the cab for 20 minutes with the engine off. Not because I needed anything. Because I needed to collect myself before I walked into that house for the first time since 2018. Before I stood in the rooms where my father had lived for 51 years and tried to hold that reality steady in my chest without letting it tip me over. I thought about the Sunday calls. I thought about a hand against a second-floor window in August. I thought about a porch handshake in 1994 that lasted 3 seconds longer than it needed to, from a man who was not built for long goodbyes, and so put everything he had into the handshake instead. I started the engine and got back on the highway. When I turned onto Birchwood Street at 2:45 in the afternoon, the first thing I saw was Gloria, already positioned, already performing, arms crossed and voice calibrated to carry to every porch on the block. She said I didn't live there. She said I hadn't been part of that family for 20 years, which was not accurate by any factual measure, but was true in the version of the story she had been telling herself and everyone around her for long enough that the distinction had stopped mattering to her. She said I had no business showing up now that he was gone. She delivered that last line with a particular weight, the weight of a verdict that has been rehearsed until the delivery feels natural. The street was quiet except for her voice and the wind moving through the big silver maple Raymond had planted in the front yard in 1971. A woman across the street had stopped on the sidewalk with her dog. A man 2 houses down had come out onto his porch. Nobody said anything in my defense. I stood at the edge of the driveway in my work boots and flannel jacket, and I waited until every prepared word was out of her. Then I said, quietly, that I was there to pay my respects to my father. She told me I could do that from the curb. Then she took out her phone, held it up, and told me she was one call away from involving the police. I looked past her at the front door. Behind the storm screen, Terry was standing in the hallway. He was looking at the floor. He did not come outside. He did not say my name. He did not do anything at all, and I want you to understand what that specific silence meant, because it is the part of this story I have spent the most time with since. Gloria's behavior made a kind of sense given everything she had built herself into over 18 years. She had decided she owned that house in every way that felt real to her, and a man showing up to challenge that on the day of a funeral was a threat she responded to with the only tools she had. I understood her, in the cold way you understand a problem after you have studied it long enough. But Terry made a choice. He stood in that hallway with full awareness of what was happening outside, with full knowledge of everything I had done for our father over 18 years, and he looked at the floor. That was not helplessness. That was a decision, made in real time, about who he was willing to be when it cost him something to be anything else. And it told me everything I needed to know about how the next 60 days were going to go. Gloria made the call. Officer Brian Mercer arrived 8 minutes later, young and careful in the way that good officers learn to be when they walk into something that doesn't fit the standard categories. He approached me first. He asked what was going on. I told him my father had died, and I had come for the funeral, and the woman on the driveway was telling me I was not welcome. He asked if I had documentation establishing my right to be there. I told him I did. I reached into the cab of my truck and took out the manila envelope Gerald Hartwell's office had sent me 3 months earlier, and I handed Mercer the top document. He read it slowly. He read it twice. It was a certified copy of the probate court's preliminary ruling, confirming Dennis Allen Calloway as the sole designated heir to the property at that address, the structure, all fixtures, and all personal property within it. Mercer looked up. He looked at Gloria. He walked over to her and held out the document and asked, in a tone that was perfectly neutral and somehow devastating for its neutrality, whether she had seen this before. She had not. I watched her face move through surprise and into something faster and more private, a recalibration happening behind the eyes in real time. The expression of someone whose entire working model of a situation has just been overturned by a piece of paper and who is trying to construct a new model fast enough that no one notices the gap. She told Mercer it had to be a mistake. She told him it was not valid. Her voice was still controlled, but the performance was entirely gone now, replaced by something she was working to keep contained, something that looked, underneath the defiance she was reaching for, a great deal like fear. Mercer told her gently that he was not positioned to adjudicate the document, but that the man on the sidewalk appeared to have a valid legal claim to the property, and she might want to contact her own attorney before making any further decisions. He handed the document back to her. She took it without looking at it and held it at her side like something she did not know what to do with, which was, I suppose, exactly what it was. I walked to the front steps and sat down. I opened the envelope and took out the full stack of papers and held out the top page toward Gloria without saying a word. She didn't take it. She was already on her phone, voice low and tight. The public version of herself completely collapsed now, talking to someone in the rapid and urgent cadence of a person who has just discovered that the ground she was standing on was not ground at all. I let her make that call. I sat on those steps in the November cold and listened to the clock on the mantel through the front door, the same clock that had been ticking in that hallway since before I was born, and I let the moment be exactly what it was. The document in my hand was the full probate order, 17 pages, with my name printed on the first page as sole legal heir. Behind it, paper clipped in chronological order, were bank statement pages going back to March of 2006. Every transfer highlighted in yellow. Every amount documented. A total circled in blue ink at the bottom of the last page. In my father's handwriting, $203,740. And beside the circle, In the same compressed printing, he had used his whole life on work orders and parts lists, and every piece of paper that mattered. 2 words. Dennis. Paid. Not a single corresponding entry from anyone else in that household. Not $1 from the 2 people who had been living in that house for 18 years while I paid for the roof over their heads from 3 states away. Terry made 2 phone calls that afternoon, first to a man named Phil Garrity, then to a law firm in the next county. Both attorneys called Gerald Hartwell's office the following morning to verify what they had been told. Hartwell called me that evening to let me know, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose thorough work is functioning exactly as designed. Both calls delivered the same answer. The court had ruled. The will was properly filed. There was no viable challenge. There was nothing left to dispute. Gloria and Terry had 60 days to vacate. The court would have required 30. The extra 30 were my decision. I did not go into the house that first night. I drove to the Delbrook Motor Inn on Route 47 and checked into room 11 and sat on the edge of the bed with the documents spread across the bedspread and a cup of motel coffee going cold on the nightstand. The room had a heating unit that clicked every 4 minutes like something trying to start and not quite managing. I organized the papers by category the way I organize everything, methodically, without rushing, because rushing is what you do when you are reacting, and I had stopped reacting a long time ago. It was in the 3rd stack of papers that I found it, tucked between the property deed and the county assessor's lot map, a plain white business envelope sealed and addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, folded once. 6 sentences. He wrote that he had kept everything, every record, every statement, every note, because he wanted there to be no question about what was what and who had done what. He wrote that Gerald Hartwell had been holding the full file since November of 2021 and was waiting for my call. He wrote that the house was mine because I had made it possible for the house to remain a house. And he wanted me to know that he had known that every single month for 18 years, even when he was not able to say it. He wrote that he was sorry about the window. And then at the bottom of the page, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, the letters a little wider and less precise, as if those lines had been written last, and the hand that wrote them was not quite steady. He wrote, "I am proud of you, son. Come home when you're ready." I read that last line 3 times. I set the paper down on the bedspread, and I looked at the wall of that motel room for a while, and I did not move. I am not going to dress it up or make it more than it was. I am not a man who falls apart easily, and I did not fall apart then. But there is a difference between not falling apart and not feeling anything, and I want to be honest about that difference, because this story is not just about property rights and probate orders. My father had been trying to tell me something from behind a second-floor window for years, and the only language available to him at the end was a piece of notepaper in a sealed envelope in a manila folder in a motel room in November. I am proud of you, son. 32 years of Sunday phone calls, and that is what it came to. 6 sentences and a line at the bottom that his hand was not quite steady enough to write cleanly. I sat with that for a long time. Then I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, set it on top of the stack of bank statements, and went to sleep. There was work to do in the morning. Gerald Hartwell was 68 years old, a 3rd-generation Delbrook attorney whose office on Main Street still had the original oak wainscoting from when his grandfather opened the practice in 1931, and he set a banker's box on the conference table between us with the careful deliberateness of a man presenting something he is proud of. He told me Raymond had begun assembling the file in 2019 and had made 4 separate visits to the office, the last just 2 months before he died, each time delivering additional materials with the same methodical precision he had applied to everything in his life. What was in that box was 31 years of a quiet man's careful attention, and the weight of it, the physical weight of it when Hartwell slid it across the table and I put my hands on it, was something I was not prepared for. Every property tax bill since 1993 paid without exception. Utility bills organized by year going back to 2006. Every contractor receipt, every pharmacy bundle, every one of my wire transfers printed and highlighted and annotated in my father's hand, with brief margin notes identifying what each amount had been used for. December 2022, hospital balance. March 2023, new prescriptions. July 2023, garage roof patching. And at the back, in a folder labeled Simply Comparison, a yellow legal pad with 2 columns, one headed Dennis, one headed Terry and Gloria, with a running total at the bottom of each. The dentist column totaled $203,740. The Terry and Gloria column showed a zero, and above the zero, several entries in red representing money that had left Raymond's own retirement account at their suggestion. My father had drawn a line connecting the two totals and written one word between them. Evidence. He had not been keeping those records out of bitterness. Hartwell made that clear, and I believed it, because it matched everything I knew about the man. He had been keeping them out of precision, out of a lifetime habit of making sure that when something needed to be demonstrated, it could be demonstrated fully and without ambiguity. He was a machinist. He did not believe in leaving measurements to interpretation. Hartwell then told me about April of 2007. Shortly after Terry and Gloria moved in, Raymond had come to him with a concern about a legal doctrine called adverse possession, which can allow a long-term occupant to claim ownership of property they have occupied openly and continuously for a statutory period. Raymond did not want to make the arrangement feel unwelcoming, Hartwell said, but he was also not a man who left important things undocumented. So they had drafted a one-page acknowledgement of tenancy, signed by Terry and Gloria, establishing clearly that they occupied the property as guests at Raymond's discretion with no ownership interest of any kind. It had been notarized and filed with the county recorder in April of 2007 and had been sitting there quietly for 16 years. When Phil Garrity and the other attorney reviewed that document, neither of them called back with a counterargument. There was no counterargument. The document that Terry and Gloria had signed 16 years earlier, on what was probably an ordinary afternoon when it felt like a formality, was the document that ended every legal strategy they had before they could finish building it. On the 18th day of the 60-day period, I drove past the house at 7 in the morning and documented the empty driveway. On the 21st day, I could see through the kitchen window that the French door refrigerator was gone, the floor slightly cleaner in the square where it had stood. I had purchased that refrigerator in October of 2020 after a Sunday call, in which Raymond described the old one making a grinding sound at startup. Purchase receipt in my files, delivery confirmation addressed to Raymond Calloway at that address. I photographed the empty space. Over the following 2 weeks, I documented 3 additional missing items: a chest freezer I had paid for in 2018, shelving units from the basement, and the small maple writing desk that had been my father's for as long as I could remember, that he had kept near the bedroom window and used for correspondence and for keeping his checkbook and his letter paper, and, I knew, a framed photograph of the two of us at a fishing lake in Wisconsin taken in the summer of 1988. I filed a supplemental claim. Hartwell filed it cleanly, and the court acknowledged it in 2 days. The other side argued the items were personal property of the occupants. Hartwell replied with purchase receipts and delivery confirmations and a 2-paragraph letter noting, without any ornamentation at all, that the opposing party's total documented financial contribution to the household over 18 years was $0, and that in light of this, any claim to property purchased by the estate's sole heir might benefit from reconsideration before further court resources were expended. The objection was withdrawn the following day. The court ordered restitution of $3,140 plus $612 in court costs. The maple writing desk was returned in a moving blanket on a Friday morning, and I carried it back to the bedroom where it had always been, near the window that faced the silver maple in the front yard. The photograph of the two of us at the fishing lake was not with it. I placed a different copy of the same trip in the frame, one my mother had kept for years and sent me when I called to tell her what had happened. In it, my father is holding up a northern pike he just pulled out of the lake, and he is grinning in a way he almost never grinned in photographs, fully and without self-consciousness, like a man who has briefly forgotten to be composed and doesn't mind at all. He is 42 years old. He looks exactly like himself. Moving day came on a Thursday in late January. I arranged for a process server to document the departure, and I did not go to the house until I got the confirmation call. I had lunch at the counter of the diner on Route 47, cherry pie and 2 cups of coffee, sitting at the window while the fields outside lay flat and bare under a gray Illinois sky, the kind of sky that sits low over the prairie and makes the horizon feel close enough to touch. The waitress refilled my coffee without being asked. I did not look at my phone. I just sat there and let the morning be quiet for a little while, because I knew that the quiet was almost over. The confirmation came at 2:17 in the afternoon. The truck had departed, keys in the lockbox. I drove back to the house. I unlocked the front door and walked through every room. The house was imperfect in the way any house is imperfect after 18 years of occupancy, scuffs and marks and small damages that are the natural evidence of people living in a space rather than preserving it. The kitchen still smelled like the same dish soap Raymond had used for as long as I could remember. The garden in the backyard was overgrown, the beds blurred with grass, and the tomato cages from the last growing season still standing at odd angles in the soil, like the ruins of something that was once organized and cared for. I walked through it all slowly, and I let myself feel the full weight of what it meant to be standing there. Then I went to the garage. The door opened with the same grinding resistance it had always had, the spring on the left side slightly too tight, the adjustment Raymond had been meaning to make for probably 20 years. Inside, the pegboard above the workbench still had its tool outlines traced in black marker, the shapes of wrenches and pliers and screwdrivers indicating exactly where each thing was supposed to hang. Some of the tools were still there. Some of them were mine, sent home over the years because Raymond needed them and I was between jobs and wouldn't miss them. They were hanging in their outlines, exactly where they belonged. On the workbench, under a clean shop rag, was a tin box with a simple clasp. Inside was an index card in Raymond's handwriting and a key on a plain ring. Box 447 at the First Farmers Bank of Delbrook. Everything else is in here. I think you'll find it sufficient. The bank box held the original property deed from 1962, the paid-in-full mortgage documentation from 1991, a life insurance policy with me listed as sole beneficiary, and a sealed envelope containing a handwritten letter considerably longer than the 6 sentences from the motel. That letter is between my father and me, and I am going to keep it that way. What I will tell you is that he had written it by hand on 4 pages of the same notepaper, and that by the 4th page the handwriting was not steady, and that I read it twice in the bank manager's office with the door closed, and then folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket where it stayed for the rest of that day. The life insurance paid out $82,000. The property was assessed at $214,000. Combined with the accounts, the total value of what Raymond Calloway had assembled over his lifetime and protected from being dismantled and passed to the one person he knew had been holding it together from 3 states away came to just under $320,000. I want to tell you about what happened on the last day of the 60-day period, because I left something out, and I think it belongs in this story. I was in the garage that afternoon when I heard a car pull up out front. I walked around the side of the house, and Terry was standing at the edge of the driveway. Not Gloria, just Terry, alone, in a jacket I recognized from years ago, standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the front of the house the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize before it disappears. He saw me come around the corner, and we looked at each other across about 30 feet of concrete driveway, the same driveway where this had all started 2 months earlier. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, just quiet, not asking for anything, not making a case, just saying it the way you say something when it is the only true thing you have left. He said that Dad talked about me all the time. That was it. That was all he said. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he nodded once, got back in the car, and drove away. I watched the car until it turned at the end of the block. Then I went back into the garage and stood at the workbench for a while with my hands flat on the surface. I had spent 2 months being precise and methodical and correct about everything. And for about 60 seconds standing at that workbench, I was none of those things. I was just a man who had lost his father and his brother in the same season and was trying to figure out what to carry forward and what to finally put down. Then I picked up the adjustment wrench and fixed the garage door spring. It took 40 minutes. I don't know why Raymond never got around to it. I think maybe he just had other things on his mind. Mrs. Margaret Olson from across the street brought over a casserole on my second weekend in the house and sat at the kitchen table for an hour. She told me she had watched Raymond sit on the front porch every Sunday evening for years, and that there had always been something specific about those evenings, a quality of waiting, that she had never quite been able to name until now. She said that in the weeks after I had been turned away in August of 2021, Raymond had come over for coffee twice, and during the second visit, he had said something she remembered clearly. He said, in the way of a man who has compressed every strong feeling into the smallest container available to him, that he had some things to take care of, and that he thought Dennis would understand them when the time came. He was right about everything. He was right about the records and the attorney and the probate order and the signed tenancy acknowledgement from 2007. He was right that I would understand when the time came. And he was right, in the way that only patient and precise men are right, that the best response to 18 years of being quietly taken advantage of was not a confrontation or a scene or a raised voice on a driveway. It was a banker's box. It was a folder labeled evidence. It was a key on a plain ring sitting under a shop rag on a workbench, waiting for the right person to find it. I moved into the house in February. I repaired the garden beds first, turning the soil and working in compost, the beds depleted but not ruined, needing attention rather than replacement. I ordered tomato seeds from the same heirloom catalog I found in Raymond's filing cabinet, the variety he had grown for at least 20 years, a big cracked beefsteak called Mortgage Lifter. I have thought about that name more times than I can count since I first read it on the seed packet. I am not sure I will ever stop thinking about it. I fixed the garage door spring. I rehung the tools that had been taken off the pegboard in their proper outlines. I put the writing desk back by the bedroom window where it had always been. I put my father's photograph back on top of it where it had always been. Slowly, room by room and week by week, I put things back the way they were supposed to be. On the last Sunday in March, I reached for my phone at the usual time and got halfway through dialing before I remembered. I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute. Then I went out to the porch and sat in the old metal chair with the slightly uneven legs that rocks a half-inch to the left when you shift your weight. And I looked at the silver maple in the front yard, its branches just beginning to show the first small leaves of the season. And I looked at the street going quiet in the early evening. And across the way Mrs. Olson's porch light came on the way it always does at dusk. And somewhere a few blocks over a dog was barking at something with the particular conviction of a dog who has decided this specific thing is absolutely worth the effort. Here is what I want to leave you with. Gloria and Terry lived rent-free in my father's house for 18 years. They did not pay a single utility bill. They did not cover a single copay or repair cost. They replaced his furniture with their own, repainted his walls, took his name off the photographs in his own hallway, and then stood in his driveway on the day of his funeral and told his son to grieve from the curb. And when the banker's box was opened, when the probate order was filed, when the tenancy acknowledgement from 2007 surfaced from the county recorder's office, there was not one document, not one receipt, not one bank record they could put on a table to counter what was already there. 18 years of occupancy and not one piece of paper with their name on it that said they had earned a single square foot of that house. My father knew it. He had known it for years. He just waited until the record was complete enough to be unanswerable. I gave them 60 days when the law required 30. I drove past on moving day and kept going. I put a different photo in the same frame and planted the same seeds in the same beds. Some people will tell you that makes me decent. Some people will tell you that makes me calculated. I think both of those things can be true at the same time, and I am comfortable with that. The question I want to ask you is this. Gloria stood on that driveway for 18 years in her mind before she ever stood there in her body. She built a version of ownership out of furniture choices and paint colors and photographs on a hallway wall, and she believed in it completely, right up until the moment a certified court document made it impossible to believe in anymore. Does that make her a villain, or does it make her a person who made a series of small decisions that she never understood were adding up to something she would eventually have to answer for? Tell me what you think in the comments. And tell me what you would have done with those extra 30 days, because I genuinely want to know where you draw the line.